Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel with your hosts Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Hello, Mike.
Hello, Rick. How you doing today?
Oh, doing okay. Waiting for spring to actually hit. It's already a week into spring, and we're at the end of March. Today is March, 29th, 2023. And here in the Central Valley, California, usually by the end of March, we've had a whole string of 70, 75 degree days, maybe even up to 80 a few days. And this will be the first spring I can recall in my lifetime. And of course, my memory's not the best, but that we have not reached a single 70-degree day in March. And I did read the other day, it said it's the fourth coldest March ever. So I guess my feeling of just observation is correct.
Yeah.
And today's another rainy day and cold. It's going to be about low 50s or something like that.
Ouch.
So
Ouch.
we just take what we get. It's that kind of year, but we need the rain and snow. I want to find that person who prayed so hard for extra rain and snow so that I can ask them to pray for me, because their prayers really had a powerful effect.
Yes, totally. We got snow the other day. It was it's already melted, but it was maybe an inch or so the other day. So it covered the ground and everything.
Yeah.
So,
spring's going to make its breakthrough eventually. It's a little late this year, but
yeah.
And so what is today? Session number 72, is it?
Yes. Wow. No, 73.
Oh, is it 73? Okay.
73.
I've got to go back and redo my list because I had it as 72, but
Let's see
73, you say?
Yeah, I just posted 72. So we
Yeah,
are now
72. Oh, that's right. We did last week.
Yeah.
That's right. I'll have to go back and change my own notes.
Okay.
Today is 73. And then we did 72 last week. Okay.
Before we know it, we're going to be 80, and then we're just 20 away from the 100. Can you believe that?
Well, I'm fast approaching on my Tuesday night end time Bible studies. Next week will be my session 24. So combined with this one, I'm pushing 100.
You are.
Videos that I've done. And
Oh.
so I am giving people all kinds of evidence to use against me. Because we're not hiding what we think about the Bible. So
that's right. So you could either look at it as evidence or a legacy.
I know Missionary Baptist too well. I think it's evidence.
Yeah, it's evidence. That's right.
we will listen to an entire hour-long session of somebody on a Bible subject as Missionary Baptist, just to find the one thing we disagree with.
Yes, right. And then hang them high. Get a rope.
Okay, so today is session 73, and it's March the 29th of 2023, and welcome everyone. It's good to be back on with you, Mike. We're going through some things in Leviticus as we're looking for Christ in the Old Testament, and we are going to camp out today on a chapter that we will by no means bring out everything there is in it. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is to look for Christ mainly, but Leviticus 23, that famous chapter that outlines what we call the holy feast days. In the English mind, that's kind of a misnomer. It kind of draws a picture of some things that these holy days are not quite, they're certainly not always a feast, although there are some feasts and celebrations mixed in with them. Some of them require fasting. And so maybe we could use as our text Leviticus 23:37. These are the feasts, and that word feast is translated in most of our King James and New King James, but most of the newer English translations, in my mind, translate it more correctly, more closely to what it should be in our English mind. The Hebrew word moedim, moedim, and it's Strong's number 4150. If anyone wants to look it up, how it's used throughout the Old Testament. And the idea of moed, which is the singular, moed means like an appointment, keeping an appointment. So moedim, of course, the I am on any Hebrew word makes it plural. So moedim speaks about the plurality of holy days, but not just about the plurality of holy days, but the idea of repetition. In other words, it's not just that there are 7 or 8 holy feast days or appointed days, but they are to be repeated year after year, ongoing. So that also is carried in the idea of moedim. And so the word feast in our translations is appointed times or appointed feast or holy days of the Lord, of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. I really like that word convocation. I wish we used it more. It's the idea of assembling together. Part of the meaning of it, underlying meaning of it in Hebrew is the idea of dress rehearsal. And I like that thought because part of the purpose of these holy feast days, these appointed times, is very much like baptism and the Lord's Supper is to us today. It is both a look backward at what God or Christ has done for us and in our life, his deliverance, his forgiveness, his power, his mercy, his grace. But it also has a prophetic forward-looking aspect to it. These days do, as does baptism and the Lord's Supper, of our resurrection, of our glorified bodies, of the return of Christ, of our fellowship with him in eternity. And so it's a real sweeping look of past, present, and future that is brought over into our ordinances that we practice today in the church.
Yes.
Of being grateful, remembering is part of the idea of remembrance, but also a prophetic aspect. And we're going to try to bring that out because they all speak about what Christ has done for us and what he will do for us, what his plan to do is for us. And in these Jewish holy days, what God had done for them and what his future purpose for them is. So this convocation, this gathering for the purpose of rehearsing for the future, rehearsing for eternity, rehearsing for the coming of their Messiah, is all involved in these holy days.
I like to refer to a convocation as modern day Bible conference.
Modern day Bible conference. I can go for that. Now, this idea of moedim goes all the way back to original creation. And these kind of things are fascinating. For instance, in Genesis 1:14, God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons." Now, everyone knows the sun and the moon and the stars and all that affect our seasons, but we probably don't give enough thought to the idea of they're also for signs, spiritual signs, prophetic signs, signs about the Creator, first of all. Why are they even there? Who put them there? Why did he put them there? It's for signs and seasons and for days and years. So that word seasons is moed or moedim, often translated as feast. And so the moon, especially for Israel, but even the sun, there's just the different passages of time in the heavenly bodies, had a huge effect on their year, how they went through the year practicing these holy days and what each of them represent even prophetically. And the idea that Moses writing this, of course, by inspiration. So This idea of moedim, God wanted it in there. But Moses also had a special interest in including this idea of appointed times by the moon and the stars and the sun, because he is with Israel traveling to Mount Sinai, then across the wilderness, teaching them how to function as a nation. And part of what he was to teach them is what is found in Leviticus 23, those holy days scattered throughout the year. And he wanted them to understand this idea of appointed time goes all the way back to original creation. And now God is incorporating that idea into their operation as a nation in their land. And he also does that, again, it's by inspiration, but Moses is wanting to emphasize this idea because he's preparing to train them what their appointed times are, what they represent. So, for instance, this moedim idea, I'll just name the verses without going over to read them because they're familiar to us, but Genesis 17:21, Genesis 18:14, and Genesis 21:2. These are three times when God, by prediction, by prophecy, and then when it actually came to pass, regarding the birth of Isaac. And he says at least three times, it will be at the appointed time. So God had a particular time in mind for Isaac to be born. And this idea of moedim, or appointed time, is not just that God appoints a time, but God is in control of the outworking of that time, and God is in control of what happens at the appointed time. So it speaks really about the nature and power of God to fulfill his promises. And when he says, I'm appointing a time in the future for this to happen, that's why so often in the Old Testament, God uses the past tense and even the present tense at times to speak about future events or promises, because once he declares them, it's as good as done. So we could go on and on about the idea of God being in charge of events that he prophesies and has the ability to fulfill and bring to pass. In the New Testament, again, these things are carried right over into the New Testament. That little phrase, in due time, or just the right time, regarding the birth of Christ and the death of Christ. And the birth of Christ and the death of Christ are very closely connected to what we're talking about in Leviticus 23. And even Paul, when he wrote to the church at Colossae in Colossians 2:16, and a lot of people miss this because, we're not as well grounded in the Old Testament as we should be, the average church member. But when he says in Colossians 2:16, let no one judge you in food or in drink. So that's the food laws, the dietary laws. Now he gets to the appointed times, or regarding a festival, as the New King James calls it. They have a little footnote that says it could mean feast, but it's the annual feast days. Or a new moon, that's each month, it's the monthly. Or sabbath, that's the weekly. So what he's saying in these three terms, feast, new moon, and Sabbath, is regarding their annual appointed times, their monthly appointed times, and their weekly appointed times. He's breaking down their year into different periods of time in connection to these holy feast days, weekly, yearly, and monthly. And then there's a verse in Habakkuk that really ties into this that I want to read, because this is my one of my text passages for my Tuesday night end times Bible studies, is Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 2 and 3. Most everyone's familiar with verse 4, the just shall live by faith. That's one of the main verses Paul builds a lot of his writings around. But verse 2 and 3 are also very important. Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. Well, there's a lot to say about that, which I won't because it's not our subject, but how we are supposed to try to present the Bible in a plain way so people can understand it and run with it. And then verse 3, for the vision is yet for an appointed time. What does the old King James say on that, Mike? Habakkuk 2:3.
Pretty much same thing. For the vision is yet for an appointed time.
Okay. So there's the idea of moedim, appointed time. But at the end, it will speak and it will not lie, though it tarries. So there's a lot of prophecy right here, huh? Prophecy tarries. And so Peter talks about that. People mock prophecy and say, where is the promise of his coming? All things remain the same as they've always been. And so regarding prophecy, you have to understand, though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. God will bring his appointed times to pass. It will not tarry when it becomes time. When it becomes time, it will tarry no longer, and it will happen exactly as God says it would. So this idea is all through the Bible, and it's incorporated into these holy days. And in Leviticus 23, if we just kind of look at the general layout of it, we say there are 7 holy feast days, but really in this chapter, there are 8. And it ties in with what we've looked at before in previous sessions. This principle of 7 plus 1 equals 8 is very common in Scripture, where there will be a set of 7 kind of together, and then this 8th or this one other kind of set aside, connected to it, but separate from it. And 7 is a very important prophetic number, but so is 8. The beginning of new things and all things new. And so even though it lists 7 annual moedim, it lists a weekly moedim to start in verse 3 of the weekly Sabbath. And so 7 plus 1 equals 8. 7 annual and 1 weekly. Another thing I would point out in this chapter I think is real interesting. At the end of verse 3, it is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. So it's to be a national observance, but practiced in each family, in each home. So it's more of a family experience that all the families are observing, so it becomes national, but he breaks it, the weekly, more down into the family unit, and then the 7 annual holy days are more national in idea. So God is concerned with the family, and God is concerned with the nation, just as he still is today, concerned with the family, because that is a divine institution, and he's concerned with the corporate, the church, because that is also a divine institution. So this chapter covers both divine institutions. Part of these to be practiced within each home. Part of these are to be practiced on a national level. So the family and the nation is blended together, just as families and the church today are to be blended together. One reinforcing the other.
Yes.
A godly home reinforcing a godly church, and a godly church reinforcing a godly home.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the purpose of these in an overall sense. One of the purposes of these, the weekly Sabbath and the 7 annual feast days, was simply to organize and order their year. In other words, their calendar. This is how their annual calendar would work out. And then, like we have our calendars day, On July 4th, it may have written on the calendar, Independence Day, and then Thanksgiving, and the end of November, and Christmas, and Easter, and all those, Memorial Day. You'll see them written on your calendar. So you look at the annual calendar, and you'll pick out different holidays we have for our nation. Well, that's what they had. They kind of organized their year for them, which is a good thing. It's good to organize your year. So we talked last week, God was creating an educated people besides a holy people by having them read and write their laws. So it was giving them the ability to read and write and to teach their children and pass it on to generations. Well, their feast days partly was to simply organize their year, again, as a set apart nation from the other nations. What other nations organize their year like Israel did? But it just gives you a sense of forward moving, looking toward the future, the special days each year, that it's going to pass from generation to generation. And that just adds a stability idea to a people. And some traditions are good and some traditions may not be so good, but traditions help solidify a feeling of togetherness, of a future, of a common practice and heritage, and just so many benefits to that. And another purpose of these, especially these 7 annual, is to celebrate their harvests. But let me come back real quick. The Sabbath then would be the 7 + 1 = 8, that principle. And so I'm glad it's included in this chapter. But another purpose is to celebrate their harvests. And here where I live, and even somewhat where you live in the valley there of Missoula, a lot of crops. But here in the Central Valley, especially California, a lot of crops. And these feasts had a lot to do with spring crops and then the final fall harvest crops, and then the ongoing crops through the summer. And that's connected to Pentecost. And the reason I bring that up is I've often connected, their climate, their growing season and all that is very similar to where I live in the Central Valley. So we have this abundance of spring crops, abundance of summer crops, abundance of the harvest at the end of the fall crops. They did too, and these feasts highlight agricultural cycles. And then it points them back to the one who provides it, the creator, the giver of life, the one who blesses. And he told them, if you obey me, I'll bless you with abundance of food and crops, and the agriculture part of their, because they were an agricultural society. But then a really important thing that these feast days speak to is truth about God, because he says in verse 2, these are my feasts, my moedim. They speak about him. And I don't want to press this too far, but I think there's really something in this. We know there are three spring feasts, but they're really one. They're 3 in 1. So there's a Trinity idea right there. And at the end, in the fall, there's 3 in 1. So again, the Trinity idea. But then that single one in the late spring, early summer, Shavuot, Pentecost, Feast of Weeks, is all by itself. So this idea of there's 3 in 1, but it's really just 1, but then there's 3 in 1 again to close out the year. It's like God is saying in these feasts, I'm only one God, but I'm 3 persons in one God. And there's 3. Someone watching this may think I'm pressing that too far, but there's something in these feast days where he's speaking about his very nature, his essence, his makeup. And then there's also a long-term prophetic meaning to these. We call it God's calendar. And it's not just for his people Israel, for their year, but it's also his timetable for the distant future regarding his plan for Israel and for their Messiah and for our Savior, our King, our Lord, who will come back. There's a message for the nations. There's a message for the church, because each set, here it comes back to the 7 + 1 = 8. The design of these are all a 7 + 1 framework. So you have the overall, there's 7, but there's +1, the weekly Sabbath as it starts out. So that's 8. Unleavened bread in the spring, but it's also called the Passover. The Passover is connected with it. So the unleavened bread is 7 days, but there's a day set apart to start it called Passover. So Passover is kind of part of it, but kind of separate from it. So 7 + 1 = 8. Pentecost, Feast of Weeks, is 7 Sabbaths plus 1 day, totaling 50. So again, this idea of 7 + 1. The final feast at the tabernacle, Sukkot, booths, is 7 days in their booths, then an 8th day called the Great Day of celebration. So 7 being the number of completion, but 8 is the number of new things. So this idea incorporates into this of a newness, a freshness, a new day. Behold, I make all things new. So within these feast days, he's driving toward the ultimate goal of new heavens and a new earth, and New Jerusalem.
Yes.
Built right into these. So there's a lot more we could say about that, but hopefully that's enough to get people's minds to thinking.
And here again, we keep mentioning the anti doctrine to this would be dispensationalism. And what you're presenting here is a fluidity, a flow laid down by God with his calendar and this timetable, and working it out little bit by little bit in each dispensation, if you will, regulated time. But in the end, it's one continuous, one big plan, just worked out in this fashion. And so it's that's why
we may not get into this today, but maybe next session. But even in the millennial, some of this is going to be brought back into regular practice.
It is.
So it shows us that God has a long-term plan with all of this, and wants us to understand that it was not just for a nation called Israel to organize their year and to remember their God, but built into it are some things so very prophetic about the two comings of Christ. And even if we think about, so let's think about it this way. Because I guess they were supposed to understand this, even built into their own feast days, but it seems like they had lost much of this. That in the spring, you start with Passover, is the middle of the first month. The middle of the 7th month is Tabernacles. So the first feast day and the last feast day are as far apart as they can possibly be on a calendar. 6 months to the day apart. it's like God is, but we're fond of saying, and I agree with this, that the spring feast days speak mainly about the first coming of Christ. The fall feast days speak mainly about his second coming. And if that is true, and I think that it is, then he's saying that there are two comings, and they are separated by a long gap of time. And I think that's built into these feast days, that the Jews lost sight of or did not emphasize enough that he had to fulfill the spring feast days first, go back to his father, and after a long gap of time, according to their feast days, as long as possible on their calendar, are the holy days speaking about his second coming. So even built into the feast days is a rejection of the idea of the imminence of the return of Christ. The fall feast days could not happen at any time after the spring feast days. They happened at a far distant time on the calendar, as far distant as is possible on a yearly calendar.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like God is shouting, in a way, there are two comings. They are separated by a long gap of time. There is no idea of imminence built into God's calendar of the first and second coming of Christ.
And that's why Jesus said, I am the first and the last. The first month and then the last month.
That's
on their
great.
calendar.
We usually just apply it to the alphabet, don't we? The first letter, Alpha and Omega, the first and last letter of the alphabet, and everything in between. But yeah, you're right. I hadn't really applied it quite that way before. I am the first month and the last month, as far as the feast days go.
Yeah. Yeah. And as far as his comings is what you're pointing out, his coming. So he couldn't come imminently because there's a locked in calendar here.
There was an appointed time.
An appointed time.
Jesus said about his Father.
Yeah.
There is an appointed time for my return.
Yeah.
And my Father knows that time, and he'll let me know when that time is. And when that time comes, nothing can stop it.
That's why then in Revelation, behold, I come quickly. So once these things start to unravel, what you said back in Habakkuk, they'll happen quickly.
So I hope we're bringing out enough for people's minds to be challenged of how much there is in Leviticus 23. How much of the whole Bible is contained in Leviticus 23 of these feast days? I mean, even look at like Now let me see. Let me do this. Let's just see if this works. You may have to correct me on this. The close connection between the spring feast days and the fall feast days, the correlation between them is the same close correlation between the first and second coming of Christ. Let me explain it this way. They're separated by time, like his two comings, but they're closely connected to each other. So Passover in spring speaks to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. They both speak so loudly of the shed blood of Christ, his purpose in redemption, his purpose in salvation, his purpose in regeneration of his creation as well as individuals. They both, Passover and the Day of Atonement, have as central the killing of innocent animals. In Passover, it's a lamb. In Atonement, it's especially two goats. And The reason it's called Yom Kippur, the P-U-R, speaks about lots, like we have the Feast of Purim, is the casting of lots in the book of Esther. Well, it's from this, Yom Kippur comes from the same word, P-U-R, lots, the day of casting of lots, because they would cast lots between those two goats, the goat that was killed and the scapegoat that was sent out into the wilderness. That's why it's called Yom Kippur. But the idea of it being the Day of Atonement and Passover, I think, can be closely connected to each other. And then the first fruits in the spring speaks to trumpets, Feast of Trumpets in the fall, because both of them speak of the resurrection. First fruits of his resurrection and trumpets of our resurrection. And the first day of the seventh month being the ushering in of the millennial. And then you have both the idea of the unleavened bread speaking to the spring harvest, and tabernacles speaking to God's provision of them in the wilderness, but of the ending of the fall harvest. There's connections between unleavened bread and tabernacle, also in the sense that they're both a week-long observance, but unleavened bread has an eighth attached to it, Passover, to start it, where tabernacles has an eighth to close it. And so it's almost as if God is saying, starting with Passover and ending with the last great day, the eighth day, where they'd come out of their booths and they'd have a big celebration, because that last great day really celebrates the renewal of all things, which is what number 8 represents. But it began with an eighth day Passover. So what Christ did on the cross and his resurrection did not fulfill all prophecies, but it guaranteed, it secured all prophecies. So Passover begins what is fulfilled in tabernacles in that last great eighth day. So again, this continuum of the spring and the fall feast and the first and second coming of Christ, we look at them as, and they are separated by a long gap of time, and we look at them as almost like two separate events, but God looks at everything at the return of Christ is a process that began and cannot be stopped, that began at the first coming of Christ in his death and resurrection.
I like your previous two R's. One was redemption, associated with Passover and Yom Kippur, and then you mentioned a resurrection, first fruits into trumpets, and then unleavened bread. I'm going to give you a third R if you didn't have one. Unleavened bread and tabernacle speaks to renewal.
Renewal. That's good. That's a good way to do it. 3 R's. It's a good 3-point outline, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The covenant was renewed with Israel after they went through their 30 days of repentance and mourning. But the covenant was renewed. And so even unleavened bread is a renewing, a refreshing, a renewing of one's commitment or service after Passover of unleavened bread. So you're showing your consecration unto God. And so I like that. So I wrote that down: redemption, resurrection, and renewal.
I like that. It's a good way to summarize all the stumbling around I just did.
No, you.
The spring feast and the fall feast as being so closely connected to each other.
Oh, I think you laid it out very well, and I hope our viewers pick up on that succession and that connection with one another.
And these fall feasts, let me see, how should I say this? Well, first of all, the Feast of what we call trumpets, they call it Yom Teruah.
Mm-hmm.
And Teruah does not mean trumpets necessarily, although trumpets do make a loud noise, but it means noise. It means, it's actually the same word used in Joshua at Jericho, when that last day that make all that noise,
Mm-hmm.
shouts and
Mm-hmm.
trumpets, noise, and
Mm-hmm.
everything that they made that brought down the walls. That's what Teruah means. And so the Feast of Trumpets was, it heralded the end of the harvest and a new year ahead. So again, an ending and a beginning,
Mm-hmm.
both are incorporated into it.
Mm-hmm.
A past, because Tabernacles being the final one, spoke of their wilderness travel and deliverance out of Egypt, but that final day of celebration, coming out of their booths and celebrating, speaks of the future of our new bodies. We're going to move out of this temporary tabernacle,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
move into our permanent home.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's just so many spiritual doctrines and truths that can be brought out from these holy feast days.
Brother Rick, I have a video of this. I'm assuming a Jewish person sounding the shofar with these different sounds. Teruah being one of them, and then there were two others. And so maybe next time I think about it, we
Do
can
that
maybe
because
share that.
this general subject demands a lot more than one session, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot more both of us can put together. I think you have some outlines, I have some outlines, maybe go and review them before our next session and try to tie a lot of this information together, summarize
Mm-hmm.
some of it. For instance, the seventh month, when the fall feast days happened, of course, they all start with a new moon, and it's also called today Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, kind of a new year in a sense, although that's not really taught in the Bible. The new year began in the spring, and then Passover kind of became the first feast they would celebrate in the new year. And it's interesting that, again, trying to tie the spring and the fall feast together, and I tied Passover and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, together. Maybe a better way to tie them together from what I already said is that the Day of Atonement was the 10th day of the seventh month. What happened in the spring on the 10th day of the first month?
The lamb was chosen.
Lamb was chosen.
Yes.
So there's the connection.
Mm-hmm.
And then Passover day on the 14th into the 15th day is the same as the start of the Feast of Tabernacles, the 15th day of the seventh month. So God purposely tied all these together. And by doing that, that meant that Passover and Tabernacles. So think about it this way. There's just a lot of layers in this.
Mm-hmm.
Passover was when they were to leave Egypt by night. But the fact that God placed it in the middle of the month would mean what? It'd mean a full moon.
Yeah.
So Passover started on a full moon, and Passover is always on a full moon. Speaking about Christ as the light of the world, light shining in darkness is what the moon represents. And then Tabernacles, when he required them to move out of their well-lit homes into their temporary booths, was also on a full moon, 15th of the month. So God made sure that these two initial travels in darkness and temporary homes would be when he would be shining on them from the heavens in the form of his moon that he had created for the purpose of having light at nighttime.
Mm-hmm.
So all this just kind of ties in original creation for signs and seasons, as we started out in Genesis 1, but also for very practical blessings.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that Passover and Tabernacles, which both involve darkness, has a heavenly body of light to shine upon them to help them along the way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's a beautiful thing to me.
It is, yes.
That's
Yes.
something that's often not brought up.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like God had this thing planned ahead, way ahead.
You think he had to like sit down, the Trinity had to sit down and let's have a council meeting to
Yes.
figure all this out.
Yes, yes.
But all of this, and there's more we could bring on. I hope next session we'll even research it further, because I'm thinking we're hitting on some things that need to be developed even in more detail, because all this speaks about not just that God is a God of order, but that God is a God of precision.
Mm-hmm.
And even down to the finest detail, there are reasons behind it that speak about God's protection and provision, blessings, his love for his people, his watch care over them. And I would like maybe next session, I think maybe we'll end about right here, because I want to develop this idea of the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Noise, translated shout in regarding Joshua and Jericho, and simply close by asking a question. Do you know of any passages in the New Testament that speaks about a shout and a trumpet connected together? And it does not speak. It's a noisy day, isn't it?
Right.
Day of noise. The return of
Yes.
Christ and our resurrection.
Yes.
In 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17 speaks about a noisy event,
Mm-hmm.
not a secret, quiet rapture.
Right.
All of a sudden, we wonder where everyone is.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It is going to be a day full of racket,
Mm-hmm.
shake people down to their very foundations.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I want to develop that a little bit more, and also the Day of Atonement in Tabernacles, because we want to maybe emphasize more of the fall feast days and the return of Christ, prophetic nature of them. But we've kind of neglected Pentecost, and poor Holy Spirit, he often gets neglected. The Father and the Son get the glory, and the Spirit kind of gets neglected, but that is his very purpose.
Yes, right.
To shine, to put the emphasis on the Father and the Son.
Yes.
And that's what I tell people often. A sure sign that you're not being directed by the Spirit is if you're emphasizing the Spirit over the Father and the Son.
Yes.
Because the Spirit
Yes.
deflects attention from himself.
Yes, yes.
And casts it on especially the Son, but also the Father.
Yes, yes.
And but we do need to speak about Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks, kind of what it represents also in prophecy.
Back to you mentioned about the noise and the trumpets and all that. Back, you and I lived through the Jesus Revolution, and it was back in that time that the movie was very popular, A Thief in the Night.
Oh yeah,
and of course it really promoted this secret coming, but that was the push back in that time frame, that he could come any minute, and of course he didn't
what
come.
will happen when the driver of the pilot in the plane is suddenly raptured? Those poor people on that plane.
Yes.
What happened when the city bus driver is raptured?
Yes. Yeah.
And they don't know where he went.
Yeah.
Suddenly he just is missing.
Yes.
That all paints a kind of a emotional, dramatic picture, but it's not based in Bible.
Yeah, not at all. Not at all.
Well, let's both of us do some more research and planning and so that we can take all that we like just threw out there randomly today and tie up in a neat little package and make more sense of it on our next session. And I know you have quite a bit of information on all this, Mike. So as I often desire starting these sessions, I'd like more input from you, but I end up crowding you out, taking the lead too much.
Not at all.
I know
Not at all.
that was kind of the design in the beginning, but we're getting to the point where we're beyond the outlines that I am using and a lot of material that you have. And I would like to hear from what you have researched and studied through the years on these kind of things too.
I enjoy being your wingman, brother. I'll just throw in a little bit here and there, and let you run with it. And I know our viewers appreciate your thoughts and bringing in the various layers of these things. The way you laid it out today, I never would have put all that together. So we're just going to keep you going, brother. I'm just going to keep.
Well, let's just do it this way. It's like some of the TV series people watch. What do we call it? Part 2 next session. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Yes.